April 10th, 1943, Naval Air Station, Quonset Point, Rhode Island. The teletype didn't simply print, it rattled the desk like a drill sergeant. A short burst of words, spare and blunt, carried across the continent from Pacific Fleet headquarters. Japanese night harassment escalating. Guadalcanal Marines exhausted from lack of sleep. Immediate remedy required. Establish night fighter capability. Priority 1. Lieutenant Commander William J. Widhelm stood there a long moment with the paper in his hands, the ink still wet, the edges warm. The order named a new unit, VFN 75, the 1st Navy Squadron meant to hunt in darkness. The roster was lean, 18 pilots, 6 ground officers, 30 enlisted. Skill sets were thinner still. 5 aviators had serious instrument time. 3 knew the Corsair beyond a glance. The others were fresh off SNJ trainers, still wearing the shine of schoolhouse habits. On paper, it looked like a gamble. In practice, it was the only way out of a problem that was fraying nerves across the theater. What drove this crash program wasn't massive bombing raids, but a cruel economy of effort. Since August 1942, Japanese crews had discovered a simple pressure point. One airplane, often a clattering float plane older than its pilot, would drift over American outposts and ships for hours on end. Some nights, it dropped a few bombs. Other nights, it tossed flares. Often it did nothing except circle and groan. The engine was deliberately detuned to throb and pulse, a mechanical heartbeat that kept whole regiments awake. On Guadalcanal, worn-out Marines started calling the intruder Washing Machine Charlie, because the sound worked on your head like bad laundry spinning in your skull. Sleep slipped away. The next day's fight got harder. By week's end, men made mistakes that got them killed. Japan couldn't outbuild the United States and couldn't outfight American fighters in daylight for long, so they weaponized a different terrain, night itself. They screened naval air recruits for superior night vision before most of them had ever seen salt water. The standout candidates went to specialized groups flying airplanes that would have been meat grinders at noon, but turned into mental warfare after dusk. In response, American forces were, at best, improvising. Army Air Force's night fighters that reached Guadalcanal in February 1943 lacked the altitude, the radar quality, and the raw performance to change the equation. The problem wasn't just aircraft, the problem was seeing first in a place where eyes couldn't help you. The pivot began far from any flight line, inside a warren of rooms at MIT's radiation laboratory, where uniformed officers spoke the same language as civilians who wore ink-stained sleeves and thought in equations. Project Affirm, created in April 1942 under Commander Weg Taylor, set out to shrink British radar ideas into something a fighter could carry without giving up the fight. The AAPS-4 arrived first, followed by the AAPS-6, astonishing packages that gave a single-seat airplane electronic sight. Operating around a 3.2-centimeter wavelength, the APS-6 could catch a target a few miles out, then walk a pilot in until the distance wasn't measured in miles at all, but in yards. One mode let you sweep and find bearing. Another put steering cues into a gun sight picture, so your hands could follow what your gut couldn't feel. Suddenly, the dark wasn't a blanket. It was a map. Technology alone wouldn't carry you onto a pitching deck in the small hours, so the Navy tore up decades of daylight dogfight habits and started over. The first airframe to wear the new hardware was the Vought F-4IU Corsair. Field shops in Philadelphia and San Diego turned out 34 F-4U-2s with a streamlined radar pod planted on the starboard wing. The cockpit was bathed in red to protect night vision. Extra instruments arrived to make blind flying truly survivable. The scope sat where a pilot could see it without surrendering the airplane to the fates. Not long after, the Grumman Hellcat took center stage in the night game, the F6F3N and then the F6F5N. The Hellcat wasn't glamorous. It was stable, tough, and forgiving on the boat. Exactly what a man needed when the sea was black glass and the horizon was a rumor. Training turned regular pilots into something else entirely. At the Naval Auxiliary Air Facility in Charlestown, Rhode Island, the base went dark at sundown, as if someone had thrown a tarp over the world. Runways became carrier decks with only a few dim lamps to suggest shape. Arresting gear cut the concrete. Instructors ran a mid-watch culture from sunset to sunrise. Full blackout, no cheating. Students learned to trust needles over nerves, to read a radar return while flying a geometry problem, to land on a thread of light with nothing but a landing signal, officers' faint cues between them and a smear of sparks. As 6 out of 10 washed out, and not because they were cowards. The survivors came out changed, quieter, precise, with a new definition of courage. Do the right thing at exactly the right second when your body is screaming to look down. The proof arrived on October 31st, 1943. Lieutenant Hugh D. O'Neill, Jr., launching from Munda, New Georgia, watched his scope pick up a target 12 miles southeast of the Shortlands, a Mitsubishi G4M Betty. He slid in unseen, fired, and the bomber disappeared into the sea. That single intercept gave VFN 75 its first victory and sent a shock through both camps. For the Americans, night had finally stopped being a punishment. For the Japanese, the sky after sunset was no longer theirs. Expansion came like a spring tide. VFN 76 commissioned on February 1st, 1944, then VFN 76, VFN 78. And more still, 14 squadrons in time, each one feeding the fleet a steady diet of lessons learned that hardened into doctrine. On January 29, 1944, the concept took a new step. Lieutenant Commander Richard E. Harmer led F-4U-2s from USS Enterprise over the Marshall Islands, the first carrier-based night fighter combat mission. Near Truk, he stalked a Betty not by chasing its tail, but by climbing to own the vertical and ambushing from above. One pass, one explosion. No warning. This wasn't the old turning fight sprayed with moonlight. This was mathematics and patience, delivered by an engine and a radar scope. None of it came easily at sea. Landing on a carrier by day was already a ballet with bruises. At night, every flaw got loud. Early accident rates hurt. Missed wires, failed barriers. Fires that turned the deck into a furnace. Procedures matured quickly out of sheer necessity. Pilots called altitude and distance down the chute to keep spacing without sight. Fuel minimums were carved into memory. If your tanks dipped below a set number, 200 pounds, you headed for the destroyers rather than risk a flaming pileup on the ship that fed the whole task force. Night didn't forgive showmanship. It rewarded discipline. Across the Pacific, Japanese staff officers understood what they were up against, even if they could not copy it. Intercepts by fleet radio. Unit Pacific captured panicked conferences, arguments over whether to abandon night operations entirely, and wishful plans for radar warning sets that almost never worked as advertised. U.S. Industry, meanwhile, was doing what it did best: pour out hardware at a scale only a continent-spanning economy could sustain. Westinghouse alone turned out thousands of sets. Japanese factories produced fewer than 50 airborne radars for the entire war, most too frail to survive the trip from bench to mission. The next leap wasn't a new airplane, it was an entirely new rhythm for a warship. Commander Turner F. Caldwell had been the unpopular voice in early meetings, insisting that mixing day and night of fighters on the same carrier diluted both. He wanted a ship that lived by moonlight. On August 15, 1944, he got it. Night Air Group 41 climbed the gangway of USS Independence, the first carrier reconfigured specifically for night operations. The ship sprouted extra radar like a porcupine bristling. Deck lighting was remapped so it was useful to a pilot and nearly invisible to an enemy. The maintenance days shifted, crew meals shifted, sleep shifted. VFN 41 brought 14 F6F5N Hellcats. VTN 41 brought a dozen radar-equipped TBM Avengers. Everything, briefings, patrol cycles, even coffee breaks, moved to match the dark. Their first offensive sweep over the Philippines on September 12, 1944, tested a bold playbook. Arrive near dusk, orbit above enemy fields, and smash anything that tried to fly at night. Lieutenant William E. Henry led the fighter element, keeping formation tight by radar and navigating by dead reckoning. At 21:45, his scope bloomed with climbs rising off Clark Field. The fight that followed was brutally efficient. Coordinated passes, 3 minutes of shock, 6 kills, immediate panic, collisions in the dark as enemy pilots fled, crashes on blacked-out runways. By the time the group returned to the ship, Night Air Group 41 had 14 aerial victories and 20 aircraft destroyed on the ground. They hadn't lost a man. October brought Leyte Gulf, and with it a strategic demonstration. Japanese naval leaders needed eyes. American night patrols denied them. On October 24th, Lieutenant Edward Chastain of VFN-41 knocked down 3 scouts that might have directed Japanese surface forces onto Task Force 38. Without those reports, enemy formations groped and guessed and collided with fate instead of targets. Darkness had gone from hideout to trap. The hardware kept improving. Late war F6F5Ns carried the APS-6A, which could see farther, 6 miles, and track more than one target at once. IFF cut down the risk of friendly fire that haunted early sorties. VHF radios gave pilots and controllers a shared conversation over hundreds of miles. Even the small items mattered: red goggles to preserve night vision before launch, instrument paint that glowed just enough to keep you alive, practices for reading a radar scope without inducing vertigo. Training scaled up to match. The Charlestown unit pushed 50 graduates a month, often taught by men who had flown through fire and came home with practical answers. Primitive simulators built muscle memory without burning AVGIS. On the other side, Japanese training withered under fuel starvation and combat losses. New pilots arrived with thin logbooks, under 100 hours in many cases, practically no nighttime, in aircraft that had to be nursed like elderly relatives. From USS Intrepid, Lieutenant Commander James S. Gray led VFN-78 with a mindset tuned to survival and coverage. He introduced the loose juice arrangement, 2 Hellcats sweeping the same box of sky, separated enough to avoid mid-air collisions, but close enough to help. On August 31, 1944, he mauled a Betty 90 miles east of Eniwetok and kept going, proving his formation gave you more eyes without adding risk. Ideas like that spread across decks and islands on mimeographed sheets that smelled of ink and hot metal. There were nights when the war shrank to 1 cockpit and 1 man. February 3, 1945. Lieutenant Robert Blackwell of VFN-91 lost contact with USS Yorktown in a typhoon. His radar was a sulking mess. Fuel ticked away like a countdown. He navigated by dead reckoning through punches of turbulence that slammed him into the canopy. After 3 hours, a weak return crept onto his scope. It was his carrier. He trapped with less than 5 gallons remaining. The airframe never flew again. Across the line, there were men like Ensign Yukio, strapped into an obsolete Nakajima J1N on March 15, 1945, who went at 4 Hellcats alone, hit 1, and died for a reconnaissance plane's chance to get home. Courage wasn't the issue. The tools were. December 1944, Enterprise swapped out Night Air Group 41 for Night Air Group 90 under Lieutenant Commander William R. Winston. VFN-90 showed up with the latest F6F5Ns and APS-6A sets, and a bank account full of rehearsal, over 3,000 practice intercepts at Barbers Point, Hawaii. Winston stage barrier patrols that overlapped like shingles, a pattern so tight that penetration became a fantasy. Then came January 12, 1945. Lingayen Gulf. Multiple waves of Japanese aircraft tried to rip into the invasion fleet after dark. Controllers aboard ship plotted and vectored with a fluency that felt almost casual. Pilots arrived on top of targets as if placed there by hand. Lieutenant John Morris cut down 3 bombers in 1 pass when his 650s met at precisely the right range. Lieutenant William Levering ran down torpedo planes below 100 feet, living by his radar altimeter to avoid the drink while his scope held the targets against sea clutter. By the time the stars tilted toward morning, night fighters claimed 43 confirmed without a single loss. Post-war numbers said roughly 197 enemy aircraft launched. Only 34 came back in any condition to fly. Survivors admitted it felt like battling ghosts with machine guns. Behind these headlines, a less glamorous hero kept the whole machine alive. Maintenance. Men in blackout hangars fixed radar by feel and dim red light. Technicians worked on gear so new that the manuals were thinner than the problems. A chief could spend 36 hours on a single jet pump or scope and then grab 45 minutes of sleep under a wing before the next launch. The result? Night squadrons often showed readiness rates that embarrassed their daytime cousins, despite layers of extra tech. When weather turned from enemy to ally, the advantage sharpened. Japanese doctrine preferred clear skies and visible horizons. Hellcats with radar flew through rain, fog, and cloud, punching out the other side on time, while enemy airplanes sat and waited for starlight. Radios and data streams stitched ships together. TBS voice circuits let fighter directors run multiple intercepts at once. Early data links shared radar plots between vessels, so the picture you saw on one ship matched the picture your wingman heard from another. Standardized phraseology trimmed confusion. The electromagnetic spectrum, once an invisible curiosity, had become contested ground where American engineering simply outpaced its opponent. Squadrons developed fingerprints of their own. VFN 91 from USS Hornet pioneered intruder sorties, lonely fighters slipping into Japanese airspace to catch airplanes as they took off or landed. The navigation alone was a show of nerve. Hundreds of miles over black water, timed so precisely that you arrived over an enemy field within a minute or two of plan. On April 14, 1945, Lieutenant Robert Holden proved the point over Kanoya, shredding 3 aircraft and bringing his Hellcat home through foul weather and heavy fire. Admiral Toyota later acknowledged what the intruders made obvious. After dark, Japan could no longer attack or defend with confidence. Darkness had turned on them, and then the circle widened. Night capability didn't belong only to fighters. VTN-90 flew TBM-3E Avengers with radar, laying mines, launching torpedoes, even scoring air-to-air kills. Lieutenant Charles Henderson bagged 4, including a massive Kawanishi H-8K flying boat. Farther down the drawing board were improvements that hinted at a second revolution. F6F6N concepts with more power and APS-12 sets reaching out 10 miles. The F4U-5N pushing performance beyond any opponent in theater. Even jet-powered night fighters in the sketchbooks. The war's sudden end froze these ideas in place. But the runway had been poured. The tuition for this education was heavy. A mid-air between 2 Hellcats over USS Randolph on January 18, 1945, forced an immediate rule. Altitude separation for night formations wasn't a suggestion. The December 3, 1944 loss of Lieutenant Commander Robert Campbell's division during a training flight rewrote weather minimums. Each tragedy taught something that kept the next pilot alive. By 1945, the numbers made a brutal kind of sense. Night fighters were averaging an 18.1 kill ratio, outpacing daylight units that ran nearer 11.1. Part of that was surprise, part was superior tools, a large part was simple psychology. You can't measure the value of sleep with a bomb score, but you can feel its absence in the morning when fatigue shortens tempers and reactions. Investment in night capability paid returns in categories that never show up on a scoreboard. Culture shifted aboard ship and ashore. The men who flew at night were once seen as odd birds, too fond of instruments, too married to checklists. By war's end, their skill set had become a baseline for every pilot with wings. Radar interpretation, instrument fluency, clear radio work. These were no longer extras. They were the price of admission to modern war. The cowboy myth of the seat-of-the-pants ace gave way to something cooler and more meticulous. A systems operator who happened to be strapped to an engine. Logistics adjusted to carry the load. Radar required specialists beyond traditional grease and wrenches. Spare parts traveled in carefully protected crates across climates that could kill a circuit board as quickly as an enemy fighter. Factories adapted production lines so night variants didn't starve daylight squadrons of airframes. Even the small, almost silly-seeming items, red bulbs, luminous paint for dials, insulated wiring that didn't corrode, had to be supplied at scale. The Pacific was too big for a shrug. Every missing part turned into a story someone might not get to finish. By May 13, 1945, VFN 41 marked a quiet milestone when Lieutenant J. Smith became the squadron's 5th ace, tallying 7 night victories. 5 aces out of 14 pilots in one unit said more than any speech could about what specialized training and good equipment could produce. The Japanese units facing them rarely managed even a single victory against American bombers at night. The mismatch wasn't about raw courage. It was about entering a fight you couldn't see and hoping instinct could stand in for instruments. The environment added twists that grew into tactics. Tropical storms could shred a plan or hide a friend. Bioluminescent plankton revealed ship wakes to the naked eye. Squadrons learned to route and time for glow. Distances turned fuel into destiny. Lieutenant Donald Patterson of VFN 41 developed economy cruise settings that stretched range by about 20%, making deep intrusions possible. Innovations like that spread in squadron newsletters typed on paper that smelled like oil and coffee. By July 1945, the night had changed allegiance. On USS Bonhomme Richard, VFN 103 flew patrol after patrol without seeing an enemy in the air. Japanese pilots no longer volunteered for the dark. Too many hadn't returned. On July 29, 1945, Lieutenant Robert Holden of VFN 91 made what history would remember as the last night fighter intercept of the Pacific War, running down a Yokosuka P-1Y Francis, trying to photograph the invasion fleet. For 7 minutes, the enemy pilot tried every daylight trick in the book. The radar didn't blink. Holden's guns did the rest. The ledger of the campaign is stark. From April 1943 to August 1945, carrier-based night fighters were credited with 579 kills against 32 operational losses. The ratio, 18-1, was the kind of figure that sounds like boasting until you look at the context. Harassment gone, reconnaissance strangled, pilots kept alive because they weren't flying into rested defenders every morning. Men arriving in theater after mid-1944 often never experienced a night attack. The psychological advantage Japan had squeezed for 2 years dissolved into dread. The lights belong to someone else now. Those numbers sit alongside smaller entries that carry their own gravity. A Marine sleeping a full night for the first time in weeks. A pilot walking into the ready room with his hands still shaking, not because he was afraid, but because pulling off a night trap in rough water was like threading a needle with your heart ticking in your throat. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey later wrote that denying the enemy darkness had outsized influence on the collapse of Japanese air power. Daytime became the only option, and daylight was where American strengths, numbers, training, equipment, were overwhelming. The last pages of the campaign read like a ledger balanced at dawn. Commander Caldwell's Night Air Group 41 flew 1,143 sorties in 7 months, logged 4,192 combat hours, and recorded 46 victories, 5 aces. Losses that would have wrecked most day squadrons were considered acceptable against the hazards of this new kind of war. Lieutenant William Henry, 7 victories, was shot down twice, survived 18 hours in life rafts, and went back up when he could. Lieutenant Robert Murray landed blind after a hit tore away his canopy and wrecked his instruments. James Patterson snagged the last wire with a tailhook half severed. The stories pile up and point toward the same conclusion. Technology opened the door. Human beings walked through it. The legacy arrived quickly. Miniaturized radar built for a Hellcat became safer weather, flying for civilian crews after the war. Procedures born from night intercepts, vectoring, altitude separation, standardized calls mapped directly into modern air traffic control. Red lighting moved from cockpits into observatories and operating rooms. Beyond gadgets, the larger lesson became doctrine. Technological adaptation could dismantle an opponent's traditional edge in months, not decades. The Japanese Navy had nurtured night specialists for years. In less than 2, America owned the darkness by combining labs, factories, and flight decks into a single intent. Leadership at the squadron level made the difference between theory and survival. Lieutenant Commander Russell Reiser, who later took VFN 76, demanded 50 practice intercepts per pilot before combat. He wasn't trying to be cruel, he was buying lives with discipline. His squadron chalked up 23 victories with no operational losses to enemy action, a line in the history of aerial warfare that still looks impossible. Across the fleet, that kind of insistence on doing it right the first time turned into culture. On the enemy side, fear curdled into myth. Post-war interviews describe pilots who began to believe Americans had senses beyond human, seeing in the dark, reading minds, arriving out of nowhere. That kind of defeat doesn't show up on a graph. You hear it in the way a voice flattens when a man says he never wanted to fly after dark again. You see it in the way airfields went still at night, even when the weather was perfect for takeoff. August 14, 1945. VFN 91 flew a final patrol over the home islands and found no one. On August 15th, Lieutenant Commander Winston circled above Task Force 38 and watched his radar paint nothing but empty green. Somewhere below, men on deck felt the weight lift from their shoulders. The transformation had taken less than 28 months. In early 1943, American sailors had stared at the sky, powerless against the drone that stole their sleep. In mid-1945, enemy pilots chose daylight and near certain death rather than test the night. The statistics, 579 victories, 32 losses, 14 squadrons raised from nothing, tell a story. The larger truth lives in the silence of a task force at rest, in the knowledge that darkness, once a weapon turned against you, had become your shield. The war ended before the next generation of night fighters could take shape, but the blueprint was drawn. Korea, Vietnam, and everything after, borrowed from a handbook written over islands with names that still taste like salt and fear. Guadalcanal, Truk, Leyte, Okinawa. The stealth jets that slip through radar nets today share ancestry with Hellcats that stalked by scope and instinct. The concept is the same. See first, strike with precision, vanish into the black. Admiral John S. McCain, Jr. later put it simply, "We began the war defenseless against even crude night harassment, and ended it with such mastery that enemy pilots preferred capture to flying after dark." Compressed into those words is the whole arc, from desperation to dominance, in less than 2 years and under fire the entire time. The human dimension never moved off stage. Every plotted vector, every radar ping, every victory counted on one person sitting alone in a cramped cockpit, ignoring the urge to glance outside where there was nothing to see, trusting instruments, training, and a voice over the radio. If you're listening to this on What If History, you can picture the closing scene. August 15th, 1945, just before dawn. Winston's Hellcat traces a circle above the fleet. Below, carriers steady into the wind. The radar scope glows and shows a single truth: emptiness. The enemy who once owned the dark is gone. The night belongs to someone else now, and with it, the future of aerial warfare.